This topic is perhaps the broadest people function topic. When we look at organisational structures, it will encompass many different areas, and so we need to look at how the areas interact with each other, and then perhaps the possible extent and implications of any changes. So the three main parts are the key elements of the organisational structure, workforce roles, and how the organisational structure will affect the business performance. So when we look at organisational structure, what is it we're actually trying to describe by those terms? So it's the relationship between different people and functions in an organisation, and it can be vertically from shop floor workers through supervisors, managers to directors, and horizontally between the different functions of people at the same level. So remember, the different function areas will be human resources, marketing, operations management or production if you want to call it that, and the finance element. So what I want you to consider here is that in the workbook on page 33, I have begun to give you space in order to write the key terms that you will perhaps need, and I've added some extra ones on this slide so that the target that you have is by the end of the presentation you have to have written some definitions. In this you can find the chapter that might be important for this, and you will find that on page 44 of the workbook if you're struggling for some definitions. What do we need to consider then when we understand the organisational structure? So we can look then at an organisational chart. So if you flicked in your blue book now to page 15, there are a variety of different organisational structures that have been illustrated on this page that we will then go in and look at in more detail. So you'll be able to see that if you looked at figure 58.2, the one person at the top is likely to be a manager or the MD of the hierarchy, and hierarchy just tries to describe the layout, the flow, responsibility, organisation. You can see how it works from the top to the bottom. Similarly, if you were an employee at the bottom of the organisation chart, you can see who is directly above you. But we can also look at the span of control, the line management and the chain of command. So just to introduce you to the term span of control, span of control describes how many people that you are responsible for. So let's say, for instance, if you looked to the person on the top, they would be responsible for 2 people, and each of those have a 3-person span of control. So you can see that they would be responsible for the 3 people directly below them. The line management would describe where you find the supervisors, if you have middle managers, if you have high managers, and then you might have heads of functions or something like that. Depends what the job title is. And the chain of command, so you can see who it is that's going to communicate with you and pass down the orders and the directions. If you turned in your blue book then to page 7, and next to the title where it says organisation structures by function, I would like you to draw in something that represents this. So by function just means that each functional area will have a manager, or in this case a director, in charge of it, and you can see that the sales director has a span of control of 4, the marketing director has a span of control of 2 if there were just 2 people, although I think there are perhaps 2 sub-departments. And the finance director has 3 as their span of control, and then obviously because they have the titles, purchasing manager, sales manager, accounts manager, it's likely that there'll be another layer of the organisation hierarchy. So this is a fairly good representation of what you would find of an organisation chart structured by by function. To organise your business using a functional structure is a very popular way. So when we look at some of the advantages, then it's likely that each department builds up a specialist knowledge. It's likely that they will be more efficient in their job. They're likely that they'll benefit more from training. They perhaps would have a lower unit cost because of this efficiency in their nature. It's much more likely that accountability will exist because you have someone in charge of the section. You then have lower section leaders if you have supervisors, but there's much more responsibility involved, and it's easier to know what your role is, but then it's also easier to see how you fit into the overall organisation structure. One of the worrying things is that each functional area will only think about themselves, that there might be conflict between them because they don't communicate together. I suppose it depends a lot on what is the communication levels of the managers that is in charge of each of these functional areas. Not knowing what happens in other departments means that you don't actually pick up best practice, and so you could be quite resistant to change, when in reality other departments might be doing it and working really well. It depends whether or not communication has led that you would recognise this. Because you all work in your own department areas, and each department might be spread over a different location, coordination could take a long time because the decision-making process has to go up the structure and down the structure. And there could be a gap between the top and the bottom, where the top people, the managing director or some of the management, especially if you've got a few layers in the hierarchy, they might not necessarily know the people on the work floor, and that might be demotivating that. So when we consider the span of control then, the definition that you can record is the number of employees for whom a manager is required to supervise directly. So it's who do you have overall responsibility for. And there's 2 clear types then. You can have a wide span of control, so you see that in the first diagram here, that actually they're in charge of a fair number of people, and so these employees are likely to be quite motivated, willing to work on their own, maybe not to be given an awful lot of direction. It's likely that they have enough skills and perhaps a knowledgeability about the organisation that they can continue to work and not require a vast amount of the supervisor's time. In opposition to that then, you have a narrow span of control. So you have this in the yellow boxes where we have 1 manager and the narrow span of control is 2. So it's likely then that the supervisor could be quite autocratic. They'll be very knowledgeable, perhaps too knowledgeable about what your 2 employees are doing. Maybe the employees won't get the opportunity to introduce flair or be empowered as workers to try and make their own decision. But it will suit some businesses where perhaps there's new employees, they don't have the training or the skills, they don't have the experience to make decisions by themselves, and so it could actually be quite beneficial for the business. So we need to consider, is there a right span of control, or will it depend on the business itself for the management to decide on what the span of control is. So we'd like to think it depends on the personality, the skills and the experience of the manager. Manager who has a wide span of control is likely to empower his workers. They'll have lots of skills that they can overview, that they can make decisions based on past experience, that they have they're fairly confident that their workers will cope. Whereas let's say, for instance, if you're a new manager into the job, or perhaps it's a very technically challenging position, then perhaps if you only have limited skills and limited experience, it's better only to give you a couple of people, so a much smaller span of control, so that the chain of responsibility and accountability is still there. We need to consider the size and complexity of the business. So a small business where there's perhaps only one manager and you don't have many functional areas yet, you might have a vast span of control. Whereas as the business grows and you can employ more managers to be specialists, it's likely that you could enjoy the benefits of a smaller span of control. We'll need to consider whether the business is centralised in its decision making or decentralised. We'll come across that slightly later, but centralised is likely to have smaller number of managers to make decisions, where all of the decisions will be made by a pin in the middle of the organisation, if you like, whereas decentralised usually disseminates power down the management structure, where each functional area can make their own decisions, and so it's likely there will be more managers, and so naturally a smaller span of control, a narrower span of control. Then you need to consider how the business uses objectives and whether they're clear objectives throughout the business, and perhaps this will decide on the management's overall role and therefore their span of control. So there are lots of arguments about what the perfect span of control is, and you'll see that I've given you an article to read. We're going to read the article. It's on page 17. It's titled, "Is There a Right Span of Control?" It'll make you consider, is 5 the optimum span of control? And what I'd like you to do is respond to the question number 3 on page 19. So, if the number of levels of hierarchy in an organisation is reduced and all other things remain unchanged, what happens to the span of control? And you need to explain the answer. So what it's saying is, if the levels of hierarchy in the organisation are reduced, that means some of the management levels are going to be taken out. So workers at the bottom will still be the same number, but it's going to be a wider span of control. So it's important, if you talk about span of control in the exam, that you don't make generalisations and sweeping comments. There must be evidence from the case study, so you could talk about the number of outlets or the number of managers, or whether managers are given responsibility, and those characteristics will help you make reference, good appropriate reference to the span of control and whether it helps or hinders an organisation. I'd like you to turn now to page 11 in the workbook. So we're going to look at this idea of chain of command. So who holds authority within the organisation? And a nice way that we can describe that is by talking about the hierarchy and how many levels it has. So on page 11 it talks about a flat structure where there are fewer levels. So in this last half of page 11, I would like you to draw in the triangle that represents a flat hierarchy. So it's going to be not very tall, it's going to be quite wide at the bottom. So realistically, we'll have only a few levels of management, and most of the staff will be on the bottom level of the organisation structure, and you might find that that's a level that suits a wide span of control. So in opposition to that then, we need to use the top of the page where we're going to draw the tall hierarchy, and you'll see there it's a much more narrow triangle in description, and there are many more levels. The horizontal lines represent the levels of management. You could draw an arrow to that and describe that that's what the horizontal line means. And obviously, because of the number of levels in the tall hierarchy, there'll be a much more narrow span of control. What are some of the features that we might have in the organisation structure then? And these are things that you could look for in the case study. And once you've decided if it's tall or a flat structure, these are some of the things that you could talk about. So, tall structures, many layers in the hierarchy. Remember, the layers are represented by the horizontal lines, and they have a narrow span of control. That's really positive because it then means that you will know more about what the people that you have responsibility for, what they are doing, and you can be much more helpful or a hindrance in giving them instructions. Does it allow tighter control? Yes, I think so. Employees are much less likely to go away and do their own thing because there's nowhere to hide. But it does mean that there's less opportunity for delegation, which means some employees might not be satisfied because they're not given the extra responsibilities. However, in the opposition to that, because there's so many different layers, there's many more opportunities for promotion. And so that could be quite a motivational tool for some workers as they want to progress up and have the status of a different title. It's much longer for communication to pass between the layers. You need to work out as an organisation the most effective method of communication. If it's all staff email, or does it drip feed down the levels of hierarchy and therefore take a long time to reach the bottom level? And obviously there's higher costs of this tall structure for an organisation because workers that are off the base level will require more payment and rewards. For a flat structure then, a few layers in the hierarchy, we've got a wide triangle, couple of levels in it, wide span of control. So we're really saying we need workers who are well motivated, we need workers who feel empowered, that they can make decisions based on what they're going to do in their working day, how they're going to manage their time. Delegation is encouraged, so managers might be responsible for lots of different tasks and think, actually, I can motivate my workforce by allowing them to take responsibility. I will still be accountable for it, so I'll have to answer if they don't do well. But it really does build up a very good relationship between workers and management as they're aware that workers can do this. Does also mean, though, because delegation is more likely, fewer opportunities for promotion. So you need to decide if you're rewarding your employees suitably in order to do this. There is improved communication between levels because there are very few people between top and bottom. Obviously, you need to look horizontally, that if you have one manager and they have a very wide span of control, how does that manager effectively communicate on a horizontal base, so to all of the workers on the same level? But there is lower costs because there are less promotional levels. Okay, so the functional structure is the most common way for organisational structures, organisations to be organised. However, we need to recognise that there are some other sources. So I would like you to turn to page 15 now, and we're going to look at figure 58.3 for some alternative forms. So the first form that we're going to consider is the centralised, the entrepreneur. So basically, if we were to look at this, there'll be a central hub, and then there'll be lots of other organisations. The central hub could be the head office, it could be the owner, and a few other managers who want to be in control of decision making, and on each of the outside edges there could be different outlets if you were opening different branches, and it might be collective power, so that, let's say for instance, Greggs would buy all of their raw materials from different sources. But let's say for instance you had one store in Scotland, you had one store in England, one store in Wales, and one in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. You might find that that would actually be a bit of a hindrance, having a centralised purchasing system like that, and it might be likely that they can get better deals from their local thing, in which case would be decentralised, the power would go to the hubs on the outside edge. But for a centralised structure, decision making will come from the middle, and all of the information will be disseminated outwards to each of the hubs. You need to consider the time that that will take and whether or not it would be best for your organisation. And so I'll encourage you to draw this diagram. If you look on page 10 in the workbook, you'll see that there's a little bit of information about centralised and decentralised structures, and so you should talk about the flow and draw a diagram that will represent this. Again, if you look to figure 58.3 on page 15, this is the matrix structure. Now this is a slightly different diagram than what's on the number C, the matrix structure. It's quite often service providers will do that, where there are many different projects that you're working on, and you'll have someone from each of the functional areas join the project, and so you will have a functional manager as well as a project manager. So it's almost as if there are two people looking after you, and the reason for this is the project manager is likely to change once your element of the project has finished. You would move on, and so groups will come together from the different functional areas for a given purpose, and when the tasks are finished, that could move on. You would see this idea in the school, where you have subject teachers, but you also have pastoral care as well, in the form of your tutor or the sixth form team. And so that would be a good description of the structure that was evident in school. And so I'm going to encourage you to draw either the diagram that you see in front of you or the one from page 15, and I would like you to draw that onto page 9 of your workbook, where there is a small amount of information on the matrix structure. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit more on delayering. So remember, you might want to look back at page 19 in the workbook. I've asked you to answer question 3, and perhaps that is actually asking you about delayering. So remember the definition. If you need to add it to your key terms, you're going to remove a layer of management from the hierarchy of the organisation. The big benefit of this, the one that you're always going to say first, is that it's lower labour costs. Remember, there's an opportunity cost here. If you're not paying on labour costs, it then allows you to spend the money on other things, to spend it in research and development, to spend it in training, to widen your product range or your service capabilities. Remember, you could invest it in technology, you could invest it in customer service. What else could we say? So these would be, I've got 1 point in my argument, but it's not enough to get me my full analysis. So let's see, I could talk about faster decision making. Why would that be of benefit? So I can be much more customer orientated. I can perhaps allow my managers to make decisions that would suit them in the local area that they work in. We'll have shorter communication paths, but remember that that's a vertical element, and so decision making will be quicker. Stimulating employee innovation. So often management level haven't got time to do everything, so it's up to employees to come up with new ideas and better ways of working. Remember, innovation is all about doing things new, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with the product. It can be the other features that mean that the working environment is a good working environment. However, we must also consider that whilst we've taken away some of the management layers, it will widen the span of control. So do your managers really know what your workers are doing? Do the employees feel threatened by this? Are they pleased by this? Do they take on a role? Do they feel empowered? Will it be beneficial to them? You need to look for clues. When we consider delegation, these are just some definitions that I think are particularly important. They're words that I've used regularly during this slideshow, and you've got to feel very comfortable that you're using the right word at the right time. So delegation is the process of passing authority down the hierarchy from a manager to a subordinate. So maybe you don't have the opportunity to promote your employee, but maybe you want to give them some power, a responsibility of their own, which will maybe keep them in the organisation rather than looking for employment somewhere else. So to be responsible then is to be accountable for one's actions. So even if a manager gives away the authority to the subordinate, to the employee has to be responsible enough, and the management has to be confident the employee is going to be responsible in order to do it. So we give the person the authority, the power to carry out the task. It's almost like acknowledging that they're in control of that. However, a manager still has to be accountable. So even if you've given authority to somebody else, that doesn't mean to say you should wait until the very last minute to find out if it's been done. It's still responsible. It would still be your responsibility to make sure it had been completed. So if we look at some of the advantages and the limitations of delegation then, so some advantages is it will free up management time. It will allow them to do things that are perhaps more challenging, maybe things that only come up once in a blue moon, rather than regular occurring things that someone else can carry out once they've had some training or some experience of it. It will motivate your staff. They really, really like that. Staff might have local knowledge. If you think about it, low-level employees are likely to have local knowledge. The chances are that they're local workers, whereas management might come from different areas. It's not like before when you started a job at 16 and you stayed with the same firm, and so the managers have almost learned their trade from the bottom upwards. It's not like that anymore. So some managers might really appreciate other employees who have better knowledge than them. It allows flexibility. If you can delegate tasks to your workers, it means that if there's something that's happened, a one-off, a problem has occurred, it gives you the opportunity to go and deal with that. It also means that something won't be done because one worker isn't there. And it's very good for staff development, because even if your workers don't stay with you, it gives them something to write about that they've challenged in order to go out and look for employment elsewhere. There's limitations in small firms. there are only so many tasks. Do you have any to delegate, or would it then mean that your managers didn't really have enough to keep them in that position? Some customers might feel they're being fobbed off by a lower person, and so in some instances only managers will be able to do that task. Depends on the attitudes and approaches of management. If managers are all, no, I'm not giving any of it away, it's mine, that could be very poor. Especially if they're very much an autocratic manager, where they don't think that workers deserve or need or require any motivating powers to stay in employment. You've got to think of the quality of staff. Do staff want that? Not everybody wants the responsibility. Some people are quite happy having quite a narrow job role and limited tasks, so you need to consider that. You've got to consider they possibly won't have the authority if it was a crisis. Will they have the experience? I'm not sure. And then you've got to consider confidentiality. Some tasks can only really be done by managers, and they'll likely have signed a confidentiality clause. What about this word empowerment that I keep using? I'm sure there's a definition spot for this. So to give employees empowerment, then we're trying to give them the power to do their job. It's very much about you acknowledging the qualities and the training and the experience of your staff, and then saying to them, go on, you decide what it is that you're going to do, when you're going to do it, you manage the tasks. I'm just going to keep going here, I'm not going to redo that again. So when we look at our employees, you've got to decide, right, does this employee need motivation? So we all know that money motivates lots of people, but obviously not all businesses have the opportunity and availability of the cash, and so actually you might be looking for non-monetary financial rewards. And so to empower employees and give them responsibility and opportunity to develop their skills is a good motivator. Similarly, why should your customers have to wait? If you've got more than one person who can deal with their problem, because you've empowered the employee to find out the details, to make the decisions, to follow a proposal, your customers will benefit from it in the long run also. And for some, it's important that employees feel their actions count. There's no point in just going through the motions. You actually want to feel like an employee who's valuable. So what could it include? Giving authority to make decisions to the frontline staff, so everybody can give refunds if you follow the process. You can offer customers money back, little things like that. Encourage feedback from employees. Remember, they're the ones who are doing the job every day. You've got to consider that they will know best how things should be developed, what they're lacking in, what skills they need. And it shows more trust in your employees, so loyalty is an important thing. Workers should always be 100% committed, and this might be one way that you absolutely get the 100% commitment. I'm moving on now. So when we look at the business functions, this is literally just sort of a little recap. We've used a lot of these terms. So we could be looking at human resources, so who looks after your staff, who ensures that they're trained, who recruits the right people. We could look at sales and marketing, so how do you decide on the products, how do you decide on the advertising or the promotional method. Only when you've got those things in place can you say to your sales staff, these are our new product lines, or these are our services that we're going to provide. Remember that when you come to do the product life cycle, you have to get the product idea out of somewhere, and that could involve research and development. But remember, not every business will spend a vast amount of money on research and development, and it might just be a sufficient amount of some that you can copy or reap the rewards after somebody else has created the ideas. Then we have productions and operation. So remember, Britain is a low-level producer now. We don't often have, many of you won't think about going into manufacturing as it was traditionally known. And so we need to consider that operations will also include service providers dealing with your suppliers to ensure optimum resources. Customer service now is a very big function for businesses. There's so much competition that actually the service that you can provide your employees is vitally important. Then of course we have finance and accounts, so we've done the functional areas of finance, and then we have admin and IT, so support functions that perhaps without them your business would be particularly limited. When we consider the workforce roles then, it's very difficult to give you a definitive answer to this. I thought it's likely that you might have some directors. Remember, we're a growing business now. We're still managing our business, but it's unlikely it's just a one-person team. So it's likely that we'll have at least one director, even if it's only the managing director at the top of the organisation hierarchy. Then it's likely that we'll have some managers underneath that, and you can have middle managers and you can have managers. Depends how many levels are in the hierarchy. We might have team leaders, especially if you're a matrix structure organisation, that's how you've organised your business. We could also have some supervisors that will have some more management decision-making capabilities and is likely to have someone that they will be responsible for. So we quite often use these terms, and then you've got to think, right, how could I possibly write about these in the exam? So directors and managers, I'm going to treat them pretty much the same. You've just got to maybe have a little twist on what it is that you're going to write. So when we have our directors then, they're in overall charge of the business. You might have more than one director, but there's likely to be a managing director who will have overall responsibility. They are appointed by shareholders, so you've got to ask yourself the question, am I writing about a business that has LTD or PLC? That'll tell me likely if I've got a director. Remember that directors can also be let go by shareholders if you're not meeting the objectives of the organisation. Their responsibility is to coordinate key business functions. They might have a back seat role, but it's likely that in a smaller or a medium-sized business they'll have some close day-to-day involvement. Underneath our directors are our managers then, and so they will report to directors, but they'll be responsible for specific departments or activities. It depends if it's a functional organisation structure or it could be a geographical organisational structure. Depends on the overall business. They're likely to oversee the budgetary control, although they might give some responsibility for this to their low-level managers or their supervisors. Remember, it's a good motivational tool for managers, maybe not so much for supervisor roles, depends on whether the employee actually wants the responsibility. They may have some skills at that or they may not. They'll have overall responsibility for the functional area. They may delegate some tasks to subordinates, depends on their span of control, depends on the empowerment that they give their employees also, and their managerial styles will vary. So some managers will want their workers to be involved, and others will not. Below the director and the manager then we have team leaders and supervisors. So team leaders are much more likely that they'll be associated with the matrix structure. I've said that before. They try and coordinate all of the team activities. They might allocate workloads and jobs to team members. They've got to ensure that their team members have sufficient resources, and their focus may be on quality and team motivation. Supervisors are much more likely in a functional structure or a geographical structure where there's some tall hierarchy available. They might have a more narrow span of control. They'll allocate the jobs to the appropriate staff, check the quality, organise the staff and maintain the discipline. So there is actually quite a bit of a crossover here. It's more likely that team leaders will go with the matrix structure and supervisors are likely to go with a functional structure or a tall structure. So we're moving on to our final element in this section, and that's communication. So it's really to formalise some of the words and knowledge and terminology that you would already use, and just to put it more from a business idea rather than just talking about it in general terms as a person. So try and remember that we're focusing on businesses. So the exchange of information, internal communication takes place within the organisation, external takes place out with the organisation. You need to look for evidence of this in the case study. It's unlikely that there'll be a specific question directly dedicated to communication, but you could always use it as an advantage or a disadvantage, a benefit or a limitation of some other feature of the organisation structure, and that's where it falls into place. What are some of the benefits of having effective communication? So workers and management can make much more informed decisions. If they've had good feedback from customers, so if they use external communication to receive feedback from their customers, that would be a very good thing. It's easier to implement change, so if everybody is aware, so you've got to use a variety of formats, so you could include written or verbal, opportunity for employees to engage in the communication, have two-way. It encourages a more motivated workforce that's two-way communication. They feel that they can get involved. Remember I said earlier, the workforce might know best. They're on the floor all the time dealing with things. So it could improve the coordination of the workforce. And it allows organisations to be more competitive. As your workforce is more engaged, you're likely to be able to respond to things quicker. How does communication link to motivation then? I think if you don't know what's going on, you won't be motivated. You could become disengaged. You won't want to make an effort. So when we look at the motivational theorists, which you may not have done yet, but you'll be in the process of doing this with Mr. Carling. So Mayo is a motivational theorist, and he felt that there was an emphasis on the importance of communication and meeting employees' social needs. It shouldn't be a workforce where you only have to talk about the task in hand. Remember that interaction with other people is vitally important for some workers, and remember that it doesn't necessarily have to be face-to-face. Also, could be over the telephone. Maslow and Herzberg then stressed the importance of recognising employees' achievements, so that would be a pat on the back, a well done, and your self-esteem, so getting fulfilment from the job tasks that you do. This is likely to be the hardest and most challenging question that you get. So it might be, why do you want to change an organisational structure? It won't obviously be as simple as that. But there might be, what is the case for implementing? And there might be something in the case study that talks about something that isn't working well, or competitor doing this and you need to react to it. And so one of the things that you might need to consider is how to change the organisation structure. So why? What are the clues that there might be a need for change? So the business might grow and a more formal structure is appropriate. So small businesses where there's only 1 or 2 or 3 employees could be very informal in their structure. Everybody does a bit of everything. But once you get a larger organisation, you open a second outlet, or somebody needs to take more responsibility to ensure timings are correct. a more formal structure will be important. You might have to reduce costs and complexity, so this idea that we're going to delayer. Employee motivation may need boosting. Remember, our employees are key to being successful. If we don't have good quality, highly motivated staff, will we be able to satisfy consumer needs? And then, of course, customer service is particularly important in the competitive world of today. And then you've got to consider, do you want to have high quality? And if that is true, then you'll need the appropriate structures and employees in place. There could be challenges, so you might have resistance from employees, so they may feel that something won't work and you've got to communicate with them to ensure that it can go ahead smoothly. There could be disruption, and it will either increase the motivation or decrease the motivation of your staff. There could be costs involved. If you've got to delayer your organisation, you're obviously going to have to make some workers redundant. It might involve lots of costs. Similarly, if you're going to increase the layers in your organisation structure, will that not involve recruitment and selection, training? Then you've got to consider any change that you make. Will there be any negative impacts on customers? So will they not get through to the right person? Will there be a time when you have to close down? Perhaps something happens to your productivity and you are not able to satisfy consumer demand. And then will there be any blips in quality? So will there be a dip in quality, or will we see an improvement in quality? And you need to consider if that's going to be an ongoing thing, or will it be a short-term issue and perhaps won't be important in the long term. What influences your organisational structure then? So the size of the organisation, and remember, size can be determined by lots of different features. So number of employees is a good way to look at the size. You could have the number of outlets. You could have the overall sales revenue or turnover of an organisation. You could think about the nature of an organisation. So let's say, for instance, if you're a franchise, you might have a different organisation than someone who has lots of different outlets. Similarly, if you're a social enterprise, you might have a different organisational structure than before. If you have a manager that's willing to delegate organisation, you might have a decentralised structure, whereas you might have a manager who wants to keep in touch with everything and so has a centralised structure. We'll need to look at the culture and attitudes of senior management. So culture is quite a different, difficult concept to manage. So we're just going to say it's the way things are done around here. And then what is the attitude of your senior managers? So are they quite happy to let other people have some responsibility, or do they want to keep it all themselves? Then you've got to think about the skill and experience of your workforce. So if you're a small growing business, you maybe have got a lot of staff who don't have the appropriate skills and experience, in which case you might have a very tall structure where there's low level spans of control, or you might have a very skilled and experienced workforce, in which case you might have a wider span of control and a wide span of control. And we'll maybe get this last slide just as a recap without a dog barking or a phone going. I'm just waiting for the mailman now. But what does our examiners say? So you've got to check that you understand these concepts. So these are the areas that hold student answers back. Do you really know the difference between a wide and a narrow span of control? Can you tell me what the benefits and the drawbacks are? Do you know what the key concepts are that you need to think about? Then we need to think about, do you know the difference between tall and flat structures? Are you aware of the benefits and the drawbacks? Can you link it to the types of business, customer service, motivation of the workforce? You need to think about the particular business. So it's no use making an argument if it's not appropriate to the case study. And remember that Bus 2 has 2 case studies, and so it's important to only consider the case study that the question's involved in.